Good afternoon, everyone. We will go ahead and get started with today's webinar. I hope you all had a wonderful winter break. You certainly deserved one, and I hope you were able to rest up for the craziness of the second semester. I hope that by this point, everyone is familiar with how to operate the GoToWebinar platform, but just want to remind everyone that you can use the control panel that's on your screen to access handouts for today. There's also the questions feature and the chat feature. My colleague Whitney Wallace will be monitoring those. So if you're having any technical issues, please feel free to type in the chat box and Whitney can assist you. You can also use the orange arrow at the top to collapse and expand your control menu. So if it's getting in the way of your slides on the screen, just go ahead and hit the orange arrow and that will collapse the control panel. I do want you to be aware that we will be using a handout and you'll need the handout during the webinar pretty early on. So you can access that handout once again in your control panel under the handouts section. It's the NAEYC Developmentally Appropriate Practice Position Statement. And I think that's all of our housekeeping, so we will get started. So we are entering Unit 4. We are about halfway done with our early childhood support networks. We appreciate your continued engagement throughout the fall as we focus on alignment between pre-K and kindergarten. Unit 4 is going to be looking at utilizing assessment to foster that vertical alignment. In today's webinar, we are going to start by grounding ourselves in best practice, which is going to be both the NAEYC, Developmentally Appropriate Practice Position Statement, along with the Early Childhood Program Self-Assessment for pre-K and kindergarten. Then we will jump into some strategies for using assessment to increase alignment. We will tie it all together by looking at that theory of change that we introduced in our first webinar together, and then we will talk about some next steps. Before we get into Unit 4, we want to wrap up Unit 3 with the Unit 3 survey. So I don't know if you all are able to highlight that link there on your screen. I'm going to go ahead and exit out. I'm going to paste it in the chat box for you. If you will take a moment to complete that survey regarding Unit 3. So when you open it up, if you'll make sure that you say you're part of the Quality Blue group, and you'll make sure to put in that it's Unit 3, and I will give us just a few minutes to complete that survey. And once again, you can find that link in the chat box. I'm going to give us about another minute or two to complete that survey. Okay, I'm going to keep us moving along. So like I said, we're going to start by grounding ourselves in best practice by looking at the developmentally appropriate practice position statement, as well as part of the early childhood program self-assessment. So what I'd like for you all to do first is to go over to your handout section of your control panel and download the NAOIC Development Appropriate Practice Position Statement, and to turn to page 21 and 22 where you'll find Guideline 4, Assessing Children's Development and Learning. And I will give you a few minutes to read Guideline 4. Once again, that starts on page 21. And then we'll answer some questions on Slido regarding that reading. As you are reading Guideline 4, there's two questions I want you to keep in mind. The first is, what is something you read that is implemented in your district? So something you are already doing. The second question is, what is something that you read that you want to strengthen within your district? Something that you might be doing that you want to do better, or something new that you want to introduce. So keep those two things in mind as you're reading Guideline 4. Once you are finished with Guideline 4, you can hop on over to slido.com. You can use the event code A403 to join our poll. Our first question that I'm going to ask you to type a response to is, what is something you read that you want to, I'm sorry, that should be, what is something that you read that is implemented in your district? I appreciate the responses that are coming in. That first response that came in that is on the bottom definitely connects to letter H under guideline 4. It's also important to make sure that if we are using assessment, that we are using it to guide what goes on in that classroom, that we're not doing assessment just for assessment's sake, but that it really is helping teachers be better teachers and fostering further development and learning out of our students. It's important to make sure that we're using multiple sources of information to determine placement or programming next steps. It's also important to make sure that we're assessing throughout the year, not basing decisions just on one assessment window. And wait to see if there's any other responses that come in before we go to our next question. Seeing a lot of good responses here. Okay, we're going to move on to our next question. What is something that you read that you want to strengthen in your district? So this could be building upon something you already do or introducing something new within your district. Thank you for those who've started submitting their responses. Embedding assessment and analyzing data into kind of those routines definitely does make it more meaningful and helps it become part of your school's culture. It's definitely important that we find ways to get input from families, and this is an area where many schools could use some improvement, and going beyond just those parent-teacher conferences and really thinking about what are meaningful ways to get input from families. It's also great when we can utilize students as part of the evaluation of their own development and learning. I'm going to pause just for another minute or two to see if anyone else has a response they would like to share. Thank you for those new responses that came in. It's definitely important to make sure that we are growing the number of data points that we are incorporating into decisions. It's also important to make sure that we have a process to analyze that data in order to make individualized decisions for students. That one's often tricky for teachers just because of the number of students that they are having to assess and then plan instruction for. I really appreciate that last response of assessment just being an ongoing basis. Teachers should be assessing all day. Every day, every moment is an assessment opportunity. It's just learning to shift how we view assessment and also providing our teachers tools to capture all of the things they are learning in about students moment by moment in the classroom. And then how do we use that information that they capture to drive instruction, both in the moment and over the course of time? So I'm going to transition us back over to our PowerPoint slides. I appreciate everyone participating in that activity. So we're now going to shift our attention to the early childhood program self-assessment. Hopefully you all are becoming familiar with it as we kind of dive into one part of the self-assessment within each unit. So you can see that we have taken a slice from the formative or the assessment component of the program self-assessment. We have both the pre-K and kinder here side by side, or rather on top of each other. So you will see that we want formative assessments embedded throughout the school year, and we want to make sure that those assessments are assessing in pre-K things in the pre-kindergarten guidelines, and in kindergarten things that are in our foundation curriculum content areas, which refers to our ELAR, math, science, and social studies TEKS. We also want to make sure that we are using multiple forms of formative assessments, and that those assessments are also developmentally, linguistically, and culturally appropriate. In addition to our formative assessments, we do encourage the use of more formalized assessments. These are kind of our benchmarks or our screening tools. They are the list of assessment instruments that can be found on the commissioner's list. So best practice would be to utilize those 3 times a year. And we want to make sure that as district and campus leaders, you are providing supports to your teachers as they conduct these assessments. We understand that it does take time and they can be rather lengthy. And we also want to make sure that teachers feel that they can then turn around the results of those assessments to drive meaningful instruction for students. These next 3 are identical in both pre-K and kinder, so it's not broken up by those different grade levels. So we want to make sure that we have supports in place to help teachers use data to drive their instruction. We want to make sure that we have the opportunity for families to be partners in the assessment of their child's development. We also want to make sure that there's a process in place to refer students who may need intervention services. And that's really important that there is consistent follow-up to make sure that students' needs are addressed. So having a really good system in place where things don't get just kind of left on the table is important, and also making sure that teachers and administrators receive annual updates on how to implement that process. As you all know, there's staffing changes every year, and we don't want staffing changes to be the reason that a child doesn't get the services they need just because someone wasn't aware of the process. So as we jump into our strategies for using assessment to increase alignment, I want you to keep those two resources, the NAYC Developmentally Appropriate Practice Position Statement and the Early Childhood Program Self-Assessment in mind. Today we're going to talk about 3 different strategies that you can use. The first is to increase teacher and administrators' assessment literacy. Next is supporting the use of multiple forms of assessment. And lastly is supporting open and collaborative discussion of assessment data. So let's jump in to assessment literacy. Being assessment literate means that educators are expert in learners and learning, not in statistical measurement or analysis. We need to think about what that means. Often when we think about analyzing data, is it the numbers that we're really concerned about, or is it the learning that those numbers represent, and what the potential changes need to be for those learners? So as we often see in schools, we can quickly read through those assessment results. We can organize kids into groups and make referrals. And we're often just looking at a single number and don't always think about the learning that that number represents or the learner that is attached to that number. So to help teachers and administrators increase their assessment literacy, you need to build an understanding of the types, purposes, and uses of assessment, and ensure that there's a continuum of assessment used in order to improve teaching and learning. So as we look at those different types of assessments, whether it be the assessment instrument that your district utilizes from the commissioner list or an observation checklist, it's important that both teachers and administrators understand the types and purposes of those assessments and what information about both the learner and learning we get from those different types of assessment. To support assessment literacy development, it's crucial that you provide professional development that increases both teacher and administrators' appreciation for the role of assessment in teaching and learning. It increases the knowledge of assessing all developmental domains. When we think about those different developmental domains, there are definitely different approaches to how we want to assess them. For example, it's easier to assess math in a performance task basis. So if I invited a group of children to a small group table and asked them each to count out 5 bears from a bucket, I could, provide them that direct task in order to assess their ability to count objects. However, I couldn't do the same thing when it came to socio-emotional learning. I couldn't call a group of children over and say, I want to see you make friends, and just watch them make friends. So as we think about providing professional development, we have to think about how we can use it to increase the knowledge of how you assess the different developmental domains. We also want to focus on understanding multiple types of assessment, how to use those assessment results, particularly in light of what the assessment instrument was, and also what are some best practices related to assessment. When it comes to young children, there are a lot of tricky issues about validity, reliability, anti-bias that we want to be aware of. We know that young children are not the most reliable test takers, and we have to keep those factors and variables in mind when we are assessing them. So let's next turn our attention to supporting multiple forms of assessment. So we're going to go back to our Slido. And if you would please answer the question, what forms of assessment do you use in your district? You see that some people are naming specific assessment instruments, and you are welcome to do that. You can also think more globally about kind of types of assessment, whether that's observations or checklists, portfolios, developmental screeners. But you are also more than welcome to share the specific names of assessment instruments that you use as well. Give us about 30 seconds. Okay. I also see some people responded in the question box, and that is fine. I'm going to just read out those responses so everyone can hear them. So in addition to those that you can see on the screen in the Slido, we also have, actually, I think, well, I thought I could make that bigger, but I can't. So it looks like one district, they implement LAP 3 times a year, along with other tools to drive instruction and plan lessons accordingly. Once they gather data, they like to analyze the data to drive individualized instruction. We also have an RTI day set up in the calendar, so they're able to share with teachers what gains have been made and what needs to continue to happen to ensure growth. Okay. Thanks for sharing. So we did see a range of assessments, from more formalized assessments to more authentic assessments, such as observations and checklists. That is good to hear. When educators, policymakers, research, or parents call for the use of multiple measures of assessment, what they often are asking for is a holistic picture of what a student knows and can do based on a review of various sources of student performance of various kinds across various subjects conducted at different points in time. So as we think about using multiple measures, we really are doing so to get that holistic picture of a child. We have a range of learners and just a range of people within our classrooms, and we want to make sure that we are authentically understanding their development and learning by providing them multiple ways to show us what they know and are able to do. There are 3 main reasons why teachers should use multiple forms of assessment. The first is more than a single test score should be used to make decisions. As we think about ourselves as adults, we want our job performance to be based off of a range of indicators and not one evaluation at a given point in time, but a more holistic review of what we've been able to do throughout a year. So we want to offer the same to our students. We also know that multiple forms of assessment help to accurately gauge social and emotional development. Social and emotional development is often tricky to assess, and so using multiple forms of assessment helps us accurately understand a child's socio-emotional development. Young children are often considered unreliable test takers, and part of that is the nature of child development. As you all know, a skill or behavior that is present one day may not be there the next day, but is then back the day after that. So development, especially as new skills and behaviors are learned, are not constant within a child. And so we want to make sure that we didn't catch them on their off day, and then plan instruction based off of their off day, and then our instruction not meet their needs over the course of the following few weeks. So measuring children's development and learning, not only with multiple forms, but at multiple times, helps us to gain that more accurate picture. There are many different types of assessments that both teachers and teachers and administrators can utilize. Everything from projects, teacher observations, presentations, portfolios, performance tasks, rubrics, checklists, as well as those assessments from the Commissioner's list of approved assessment instruments. Each of these different assessment types afford us different opportunities to learn about a child's development and learning, and to think about what that then translates into, or how that translates into teaching. Some of these assessments are more authentic, some are more formalized, and there are pros and cons for each. We're going to take a moment to watch a video about observation assessments. Oh, I thought I had that up. Okay.
How do I organize assessment to appropriately support development and learning with childhood teachers and educators, accurate and timely information about each child's progress? To organize your assessment system, plan what and when to observe.
Oh, I'm going to pause real quick. Oh, okay, I thought for a moment you couldn't hear. I'm going to go ahead and just restart that.
Great recording with you.
Okay, so it doesn't look like you all are able to hear that. I'm going to try one last thing. I don't think that's going to work. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to post this link in the control panel in the chat box. And if you would watch the first 2 minutes and 16 seconds. So hopefully you're able to see that in the chat box. And then, like I said, just watch the first 2 minutes and 16 seconds. Observations can be a wonderful type of assessment to implement in the classroom. It's definitely, out of all of our assessment options, the most authentic and allows us to capture the most of what a child is able to do and what they know. It is often the most difficult to utilize effectively if you don't have a systematic way of implementing observations into the classroom. And you, as administrators, have a really great opportunity to support teachers as they implement observations by showing them that you value observations as a type of assessment and providing them tools and structures to support them in implementing observation assessments. There are a number of ways that you can support teachers as they introduce observations into their classroom. One is integrating observations throughout the day and embedding observation into their daily routines. So taking time to think through this in faculty meetings or PLCs about where can a teacher pause and spend time observing students throughout their day. It's often helpful to plan these observations in lesson plans so that way you're not just hoping that you remember it when you get to that point of your day. And then having teachers bring their observation notes to PLCs to read through those observation notes and think about what they mean and for that child's development and learning and what can be gleaned from those notes to then drive instruction. We also want to provide ongoing professional development to strengthen teachers' observation skills. Teaching them how to go through the observation cycle, teaching them effective ways for recording observations, and how to communicate observations to families and with colleagues are things that can be taught during professional development. It's also great when you can provide technology tools that streamline observations and analysis. So this might be the hardware, such as a tablet of sorts or a video camera, or it might be some of the software, such as apps that are on those tablets that help teachers record those observations, or setting spreadsheets up on their computers to help them capture those observations. When you're supporting multiple forms of assessment, you want to begin by building a variety of assessment tools into curriculum maps or your unit guides, and making sure that those assessment tools are there for all developmental domains. This looks like providing observation tools, checklists, performance task prompts, and mastery rubrics in those curriculum maps or unit guides. We also want to help teachers make connections between universal screeners or progress monitoring tools and the classroom instruction in those curriculum maps and unit guides. So if you know the assessment progression within those universal screeners or progress monitoring tools, you can embed that into those curriculum maps to help teachers know help teachers understand how what is being assessed connects to what is being taught. You also want to make sure you're providing guidance on how to use data from multiple assessments to drive planning and instruction. Here's an example of an observation tool that's pretty easy to make. So this observation tool is for math, for Unit 1 in probably a kindergarten class. And Unit 1 is focusing on numbers 0 through 10. And you will see that there are the student's name along the left-hand side. And then up at the top, you see that there is the progression of counting. So using number words, which moves into rote counting, which moves into one-to-one correspondence, and eventually to cardinality. You'll also see how we made connections from that developmental progression to the kindergarten mathematics TEKS. And this tool allows teachers to observe um, those math skills that are pretty straightforward that maybe don't warrant writing out a whole observation note, because using number words or rote counting really looks one way. So there's no need to write something out in sentence form, but we want to provide teachers a way to document when they notice students demonstrating those skills. So with a tool like this, which you can make for um, many of the TEKs, especially those that have some sort of progression to them, the teachers would simply write the date under the skill, write the date on which they observed the student. I can't talk today, I'm so sorry. They're going to record the date under the skill when they saw the student performing that skill. The teachers can then use this on a daily basis to gauge where students are at. They can also look at it when they are planning to kind of grasp where students are on a weekly basis. And then they can also use it at the end of a unit to track or to observe growth over the course of that unit and use it more in a summative manner to decide at the end of the unit where a particular student is with that skill. So that third strategy that we're going to talk about is supporting open and collaborative discussions. So there are many different types of discussions that you can have with teachers around assessment. This includes analyzing assessment practices, analyzing a student assessment data, utilizing assessment data to drive planning and instruction, and planning for student transitions. When we're analyzing assessment practices, we're really looking at how we are assessing students. So if you are implementing a particular assessment from the commissioner's list, how your teachers are doing that. Also thinking about how we are doing observation. So this isn't as much about what we're learning from these assessments, but really how we are conducting those assessments. When we spend time thinking about how we are doing those assessments, it increases the validity and reliability of those assessments. We also want to make sure that we are talking about how we are analyzing assessment data. So this is still not actually doing the analysis of the data, but just talking about that process for analyzing the data. Then we can move into utilizing that data to drive planning and instruction. This is an area where a lot of us focus on, but we want to make sure we're rounding out those discussions with the assessment practices, the assessment, just general assessment data, analyzing skills. And then lastly, also thinking about how we are planning for students' transitions from one grade level to the next. And using data to drive the planning for those transitions. You can have these discussions in different settings. Sometimes you want to have vertical team meetings where you have more than one grade level, where you're talking through this, through those topics. But we also want to make sure in our PLCs we're having time just as a grade level to have these conversations as well. So some ideas for structuring these discussions include working in cross grade level pairs. So some of these discussions are harder to have as a whole group, so it's easier to get deep into those discussions when you're just having a one-on-one conversation with someone else. So if you are in a vertical PLC, pairing a pre-K teacher and a kinder teacher together to have those discussions. You can also focus on one specific level of students during the discussion. So your low students, your medium students, or your high students, rather than trying to hit all of them in one discussion. You might also consider focusing on one specific skill that is shared across grade levels. So here we've provided some of those like rhyming, subitizing, vocabulary, friendship skills. Also, it's important to think about discussing assessment management processes, routines, or structures. So rather than talking about how you're assessing, or I'm not sorry, I'm sorry, rather than talking about what you're assessing, talking about how you're assessing. So getting teachers to share how they manage assessing 20 students using a assessment tool off of the commissioner's list, what that looks like, how they create structures to make that assessment more streamlined. So today we talked about how we can align pre-K and kindergarten by utilizing assessment. We talked about three different strategies that we can use. Um, and now we're going to tie it all back together using our theory of change. So today we really focus on the implementation part of our theory of change. So implementing those developmentally appropriate practices when it comes to assessment. In order for teachers to implement those developmentally appropriate assessment practices, they need the support from their administrators. Those supports come through giving teachers time to have these discussions, through embedding things into assessment supports into curriculum maps, and there's a number of other options that you can do to support teachers as they implement those developmentally appropriate assessment practices. But it all goes back to your decisions as administrators and how you decide what those supports are going to look like. So, in order for your teachers to be implementing those developmentally appropriate practices as it relates to assessment, you first have to decide what developmentally appropriate practice assessment looks like, and then how you're going to support teachers in implementing those. So, over the course of this unit, we really want you to think about the following two questions. How will you implement multiple forms of assessing in your district? And how can you utilize the data to increase vertical alignment in your district? So we'll jump more into these questions on our PLC and our one-on-one phone calls. Our PLC will be on January 29th at 1 o'clock. And our guiding question will be how can using multiple forms of assessment lead to stronger alignment between pre-K and kindergarten? And I earlier today sent out all of your invites for your one-on-one calls, and we will talk about where you're at with your assessment practices within your district. I appreciate your time this afternoon, and I will hang out just for a few minutes. If there's any questions, feel free to put those in the questions box in the control panel. If you don't have any questions, I wish you well the rest of the week, and I will see you in 2 weeks. Thank you so much for your time today.